Life ****. E-text prepared by Marjorie Fulton. George Selwyn, His Letters and His Life. Edited by E. S. Roscoe and Helen Clerg. London T. Fisher Unwin Paternoster Square. 1899. Preface. In the histories and memoirs of the 18th century, the name of George Selwyn often occurs. The letters which he received have afforded frequent and valuable material to the student of the reign of George III. A large number of these were published by the late Mr. Jesse in the 4 volumes entitled George Selwyn and His Contemporaries. Except, however, that Selwyn was regarded as the first humorist of his time, little was known about him, for scarcely any letters which he wrote had until recently been found. But in the 15th report of the Historical Manuscript Commission there were printed, amongst a mass of other material, more than 200 letters from his untiring pen which had been preserved at Castle Howard. No one who has had an opportunity of examining the originals can fail to recognize the skill and labor with which the Castle Howard correspondence of Selwyn, wanting in most instances the date of the year, was arranged by Mr. Kirk on behalf of the Commission. A correspondence, however, which illustrates vividly phases of an interesting and important period of English history, appeared to be deserving of presentation to the public in a separate volume, and with the explanations necessary to make the allusions in it fully understood. A selection has therefore, in the following pages, been made from the Castle Howard letters. The aim of the editors has been to choose those which appeared most interesting and representative, and to place them in definite groups, supplementing them with such a narrative, remarks, and notes as would, without enveloping the correspondence in a quantity of extraneous material, enable the whole to present the life of Selwyn, and at the same time add another to the pictures of the age in which he lived. The dates of the letters are those ascribed to them by Mr. Kirk. The frequently incorrect spelling of proper names has not been altered. The editors desire cordially to thank Lord Carlisle, not only for the permission to publish this correspondence, but for the kind assistance which he has given in other ways to the undertaking. E.S.R.H.C. November, 1899. Chapter 1. George Selwyn, His Life, His Friends, and His Age. Chapter 2. 1767 to 1769. The correspondence commences. Frederick, 5th Earl of Carlisle, Lady Sarah Bunbury, the Duke of Grafton, Carlisle, Charles Fox, and the Hollands abroad. Current events, card-playing, a dinner at Crawford's, Lady Bolingbroke, Almack's, the Duke of Bedford, Lord Clive, the Nabobs, Corporation of Oxford sell the representation of the borough, Madame du Defa, publication of Horace Walpole's Historic Doubts on Richard III, Newmarket, London Society, gambling at the clubs, a post promised to Selwyn, elections, a purchase of wine. Vauxhall. Chapter 3. 1773 to 1777, 1779 and 1780. Politics and Society. Fox's debts, Lord Holland, news from London, interviews with Fox, the fire at Holland House, a visit to Tunbridge, provision from Yemye, county business and electioneering at Gloucester, lotteries, Fox and Carlisle, highway adventures, London Society, Newmarket intelligence, an evening in town, Charles Fox and America, Carlisle declines a court post, money from Fox, Selwyn and gambling, a private bill committee, Selwyn in bad spirits, the Royal Society, book buying, political affairs, London parks, Gainsborough, the Duchess of Kingston, Selwyn's private affairs, the Diaboliad, a dinner at the French ambassador's, politics and the clubs, in Paris, electioneering again. Chapter 4. 1781. The Disasters in America. A drum at Selwyn's, George, Lord Morpeth, Dr. Warner, sale of the Houghton pictures, the House of Commons, Pitt's first speech, Selwyn unwell, play at Brooks's, London gaieties, Fox and his new clothes, gambling, the bailiffs in Fox's house, fish, Crawford, Montem at Eton, Miemye's education, second speech of Pitt, Lord North, a court ball, society and politics, the Emperor of Austria, conversation with Fox. Personal feelings, American affairs, R.D. North and Mr. Robinson, state of politics, London society. Chapter 5. 1782. The Fall of Lord North. Fox's political principles, the 5th Duke of Bedford, a little dinner, a debate in the Commons, the attack on Lord George Germain, an evening at Brooks's, Pitt and his friends, possible changes in the cabinet, Pharaoh at White's, a story of the Duke of Richmond, an address to the King, a levee, play and politics at Brooks's, government and the opposition, Selwyn and his offices, the position of the King. Fears of change of administration, the King's objections to Fox, probable debates, political prospects. Debates and divisions, the fate of the King's friends, illness of Lord Morpeth, annoyance of Selwyn at the state of affairs, Fox and Selwyn, fall of Lord North, a new ministry, official changes, Fox and Carlyle, Carlyle's position, Morpeth and Nehemiah. Chapter 6. 1786 to 1791. The closing century. Political events. At Richmond, the Duke of Queensberry's villa, Princess Amelia, the King's illness, the French Revolution, proposed visit to Castle Howard, in Gloucestershire, affairs in France, the émigrés, society at Richmond, the French Revolution, Richmond Theatre, French friends, christening of Lady Caroline Campbell's child, Selwyn's bad health, death. Note on illustrations. Portrait of George Augustus Selwyn at the age of 51, from a pastel by Hugh Douglas Hamilton, drawn in 1770. Hamilton, who was an Irish artist of considerable reputation, was at this time working in London. After a long visit to Italy, he returned to Dublin in 1792 and was elected a member of the Royal Hibernian Academy. This drawing is in the possession of the Earl of Carlisle at Castle Howard, Yorkshire. Group of George Augustus Selwyn and Frederick, 5th Earl of Carlisle, from a picture by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Pierre the dog by the side of Selwyn is his favorite, Riton. Selwyn is dressed in a pale brown coat and breeches, a red vest trimmed with gold lace, and light grey stockings. The Earl of Carlisle in a reddish-brown coat and pale yellow vest. He wears the green ribbon and star of the Order of the Thistle. This picture was probably painted about the year 1770, and is in the possession of the Earl of Carlisle at Castle Howard, Yorkshire. Table of dates 1719. Birth 1739. Matriculated at Hart Hall, Oxford. 1740. Clerk of the Irons and Surveyor of Meltings at the Mint. 1742 to 3. In Paris, having gone down from Oxford for a time. 1745. Finally left Oxford. 1747. MP for Ludgershall. 1751. Death of father and elder brother. 1754. MP for Gloucester. 1755. Paymaster of the Works. 1767. Correspondence with 5th Earl of Carlisle commences. 1779. Registrar of the Court of Chancery of Barbados. 1780. Loses seat for Gloucester. MP for Ludgershall. 1782. Loses office of Paymaster of the Works. 1784. Surveyor General of Land Revenues of the Crown. 1791. Death. Health is the first good lent to men, a gentle disposition then next to be rich by no byways, lastly with friends to enjoy our days. Herrick Chapter 1. George Selwyn, his life, his friends, and his age. During the latter half of the 18th century no man had more friends in the select society which comprised those who were of the first importance in English politics, fashion, or sport, than George Selwyn. In one particular he was regarded as supreme and unapproachable. He was the humorist of his time. His bans mots were collected and repeated with extraordinary zest. They were enjoyed by members of Parliament at Westminster, and by fashionable ladies in the drawing-rooms of St. James's. They were told as things not to be forgotten in the letters of harassed politicians. "You must have heard all the particulars of the Duke of Northumberland's entertainment," wrote Mr. Whately in 1768 to George Grenville, the most hard-working of ministers. "Perhaps you have not heard George Selwyn's bon mot. But as usually happens when a man becomes known for his humor, jokes were fathered on Selwyn, just as half a century later any number of witticisms were attributed to Sidney Smith which he had never uttered. It was truly remarked of Selwyn at the time of his death, Many good things he did say, there was no doubt, and many he was capable of saying, but the number of good, bad, and indifferent things attributed to him as bon mots for the last 30 years of his life were sufficient to stock a foundling hospital for wit. Asterisk. Asterisk Grenville Correspondence, Volume 11. Page 372. Asterisk Gentleman's Magazine, 1791, page 94. It is therefore not surprising that Selwyn has been handed down to posterity as a wit. It is a dismal reputation. Jokes collected in contemporary memoirs fall flat after a century's keeping. The essential of their success is spontaneity, appropriateness, the appreciation even of their teller, often also a knowledge among those who hear them of the peculiarities of the persons whom they mock. When we read one of them now, we are almost inclined to wonder how such a reputation for humor could be gained. Wit is of the present. Preserved for posterity, it is as uninteresting as a faded flower, nor can it recall to us memories sunny or sad. But Selwyn was a man who, while filling a conspicuous place in the fashionable life of the age, was also so intimate with statesmen and politicians, and so thoroughly lives in his correspondence, that in following his life we find ourselves one of that singular society which in the last half of the 18th century ruled the British Empire from St. James's Street. Selwyn's life, though passed in a momentous age, was uneventful, but the course of it must be traced. George Augustus Selwyn, second son of Colonel John Selwyn, of Matson, in Gloucestershire, and of Mary, daughter of General Farrington, of Kent, was born on the 11th of August 1719. His father, aide-de-camp to Marlborough and a friend of Sir Robert Walpole, was a man of character and ability, well known in the courts of the first and second George. Selwyn, however, probably inherited his wit and his enjoyment of society from his mother, who was woman of the bedchamber to Queen Charlotte. Horace Walpole writes of her as Mrs. Selwyn, mother of the famous George, and herself of much vivacity and pretty. Selwyn's elder brother died in 1751, and grief at his loss seems to have hastened the death of his father, which occurred in the same year. His sister Albinia married Thomas Townsend, second son of Charles Viscount Townsend. By this marriage the families of Selwyn and Walpole were connected. The home of the family was at Matson, a village 2.5 miles southeast of Gloucester, on the spurs of the Cotswold Hills, looking over the Severn Valley, once called Matstone. There is a good deal of obscurity as to the ownership of the manor in medieval times, but it appears to have been in the possession of what may popularly speaking be called the family of Matstone. The landowner described himself by the place. Ego Philippus de Matstone are the words of an ancient document preserved among the records of the monastery of St. Peter at Gloucester. Asterisk. Asterisk. Historia et Carcelarium Monasterii Sancti Petri Gloucestria. Edited by W. Hart, Volume 1, page 100. To come to more recent times, the manor house was built in 1594 by Sir Ambrose Willoughby. From him the estate was purchased in 1597 by Jasper Selwyn, councillor at law, of Stonehouse, who was the fourth in descent from John Selwyn, one of a Sussex family. In 1751 the direct entail was broken by Colonel Selwyn, and the property was re-entailed on the descendants of his daughter, Mrs. Townsend, though it was left by will to George Selwyn for his life. On his death it devolved on Thomas, Lord Sidney, and has since remained in the possession of the Townsend family. Walpole has given a description of the place in the days when he used to visit it. Bigland, History of Gloucestershire, Volume 2, page 200. I stayed 2 days at George Selwyn's house, called Matson, which lies on Robin Hood's Hill. It is lofty enough for an Alp, yet it is a mountain of turf to the very top, has wood scattered all over it, springs that long to be cascades in 20 places of it, and from the summit of it beats even Sir George Littleton's views, by having the city of Gloucester at its foot, and the Severn widening to the horizon. His house is small, but neat. King Charles lay here at the siege, and the Duke of York, with typical fury, hacked and hewed the window shutters of his chamber, as a memorandum of his being there. Here is a good picture of Dudley, Earl of Leicester, in his later age, and here is the very flower pot and counterfeit association for which Bishop Spratt is taken up, and the Duke of Marlborough sent to the Tower. The reservoirs on the hills supplied the city. The late Mr. Selwyn governed the borough by them, and I believe by some wine too. A little way from the town are the ruins of Lantony Priory. There remains a pretty old gateway, which G. Selwyn has begged to erect on the top of his mountain, and it will have a charming effect. Asterisk. Asterisk. The Letters of Horace Walpole. Volume 2. Page 354. Selwyn's schooldays were passed at Eton with Gray and Walpole. In 1739 he became an undergraduate of Hertford College, Oxford, or Hart Hall as it was called. It was to Hertford also that later Charles Fox went, a college which has in our own day been munificently re-endowed as a training school of principles and ideas very different from those ordinarily associated with the name of its greatest son. Hertford was in the middle of the 18th century a college where the so-called students neither toiled at books nor at physical exercise. They passed a short and merry time at the university, fashioned as nearly as might be on the mode of life of a man about town. In 1740 he was appointed to the vague-sounding office of Clerk of the Irons and Surveyor of the Meltings in the Mint, a sinecure which, after the manner of the time, required no personal attention from the holder. Even in those early days Selwyn, who went by the sobriquet of Bosky, had many friends, not only among college boys, but in London society. "You must judge by what you feel yourself," wrote Walpole to General Conway, the soldier and statesman, on the occasion of a severe illness from which Selwyn suffered in 1741. "Of what I feel for Selwyn's recovery, with the addition of what I have suffered from post to post. But as I find the whole town have had the same sentiments about him, though I am sure few so strong as myself, I will not repeat what you have heard so much. I shall write to him tonight, though he knows, without my telling him, how very much I love him. To you, my dear Harry, I am infinitely obliged for the 3 successive letters you wrote me about him, which gave me double pleasure, as they showed your attention for me at a time that you knew I must be so unhappy, and your friendship for him." But then came an interval in Selwyn's academic career, if such it may be called, since he was certainly in Paris, much in want of money, at the end of 1742 and the beginning of 1743. It is probable that he had gone down from Oxford for some irregularity. He ultimately was obliged to leave the university for the same reason. For though he re-entered his college in 1744, he only remained there until the following year, when he was sent down for an irreverent jest after dinner, having taken more to drink than was good for him. His friends, especially Sir Charles Hanbury Williams and some in authority at Oxford also, thought that Selwyn was harshly treated. Whether that were so or not, this was the end of his university career. It was not a promising beginning of a life, and for some years he was regarded as a good-natured spendthrift. The death of his elder brother and father, however, in 1751 produced a sense of responsibility, but even before this date he had been endeavoring to regain his father's goodwill. "I don't yet imagine," wrote his friend, Sir William Maynard, shortly before the death of Colonel J. Selwyn, "you are quite established in his good opinion, and if his life is but spared 1 12-month you may have an opportunity of convincing him you are in earnest in your promises of a more frugal way of life." As too often happens, the son had not time in his father's lifetime to regain his good opinion. Certainly Selwyn made no attempt to give up pleasure, though he was bent on it no doubt with a more frugal mind. He was a man of fashion and of pleasure, having his headquarters in London, paying visits now and again to great country houses as Trentham and Croom. To Bath he went as one goes now to the Riviera. In Paris too he delighted. When in the autumn of 1762 the Duke of Bedford was in France negotiating the treaty which is known in history as the Peace of Paris, it was Selwyn who accompanied the Duchess when she joined her husband. "She sets out the day after tomorrow," wrote Walpole on September 8. "Escorted to add gravity to the embassy by George Selwyn." After the treaty was completed on February 10 of the following year, as a memento of his visit, the Duke presented Selwyn with the pen with which this unpopular document was signed. Indeed, in those days he was constantly in Paris, much to the regret of his friends at home. "Do come and live among your friends who love and honor you," wrote Gilly Williams to him in the autumn of 1764, but in spite of their wishes he stayed on throughout the winter in the French capital, and when his friend Carlyle went in 1778 to America as a peace commissioner, Selwyn tried to console himself for his absence by a stay in Paris. George is now, I imagine, squaring his elbows and turning out his toes in Paris, wrote Hare to Carlyle in December of that year. Neither politics nor pleasure could prevent continual and long visits to France. Horace Walpole to H. S. Conway, Florence, March 25, 1741. Bedford Correspondence, Volume 3. Page 206. The charming country estate and house which he had inherited from his father had little attraction for Selwyn, and to the end of his life, if he could not be in town, he preferred Castle Howard, or indeed any house where he would meet with congenial spirits. "This is the second day," he once wrote to Carlyle. "I am come home to dine alone, but so it is, and if it goes on so I am determined to keep a chaplain, for although I do not stand in need of much society, I do not relish being quite alone at this time of day." All this time he was a member of Parliament. There is a little village of small red cottages with thatched roofs lying among the Wiltshire Downs between Savernake Forest and Andover. It is called Ludgershall, and has a quiet out-of-the-world look. In the 18th century it was a pocket borough, returning 2 members to Parliament, and was the property of the Selwyn family. The representation was as much in their hands as the trees in the adjoining fields. In 1747 George Selwyn had found it convenient to enter the House of Commons. In Ludgershall there were no constituents to take him to task. To be able to go to Westminster when he wished added to the variety of life. It kept him in touch with the politicians and statesmen of St. James's Street, and it made him a marketable quantity. His price was another sinecure, the place of paymaster of the works. But this he did not receive until he had inherited the family property, which gave him a hold on the city of Gloucester. For this city he was a member from 1754 to 1780, when, losing his seat at the general election, he gladly returned to his former constituency. The seat at Ludgershall was never in the nature of a true political representation, and even when member for Gloucester Selwyn seems to have attended but little to the House of Commons. He was one of a legion of sinecures, a true specimen of the placeman of the age. Possessed of some political influence, he was able to find in politics a means of increasing his income. It would be absurd to censure him because he was a sinecurist. He was acting according to the customs of the time. The man who, in the reign of George III, had the opportunity of obtaining posts which carried with them salaries and no duties would have been regarded as quixotic if he had thrown such opportunities away. In this Selwyn is thoroughly representative of his time, and his frequent anxiety lest he should be deprived of his offices is indicative of an apprehension which was felt by many others. Yet, sinecurist as he was, Selwyn often regarded his position as a hard necessity, especially when he was driven into the country to look after his constituents. He would then heartily wish himself out of Parliament. The Sorrows of a Sinecurist might well be the title of some of the letters written from Matson. Selwyn's was a life devoid of stirring incidents, and from the date at which his correspondence with Lord Carlisle begins the course of his days is indicated in his letters. It is sufficient, therefore, to state that he died at his house in Cleveland Row, St. James's, on the 25th of January 1791, still a member of Parliament, in the place where his life had been passed and among his innumerable friends. In one sense his life had been solitary, for he was never married, but an unusual love for the young which was a charming and remarkable characteristic, singularly opposed to many of his habits, had been centered on the child whom he called Mia Mia, the daughter of an Italian lady, the Marchesa Fagnani, who was for some time in England with her husband. The origin of Selwyn's interest in the child is obscure, but the story of his affection is striking and unusual. From a letter written by the Marchesa Fagnani to Selwyn in 1772 it is evident that Mia Mia, then about a year old, had been with him for some months, and in 1774 Lord Carlisle congratulates him upon the certainty of the child's remaining with him. The first mention of her in these letters occurs under date of July 23, 1774, where we have a picture of Selwyn, drawn by himself. He is sitting on his steps, the pretty, foreign-looking child in his arms, pleased at the attention she attracts. When she was 4 she was taken to pay visits with him, but it is difficult at this time to know if he or the Earl of March had charge of her. Maria Fagnani, 1771 to 1856. She was married in 1792, the year after Selwyn's death, to the Earl of Yarmouth, afterwards 3rd Marquis of Hertford. She led a life of pleasure, 1802-7, traveling on the continent with the Marshal and Roche. She had 3 children, and died at Rue Tailbout, Paris. Such interest in a young child naturally occasioned remark in London society, and the question of her paternity has never been clearly settled. In the gossip of the time, both the Duke of Queensberry and Selwyn were said to be her father. The characters of the 2 men, however, and various points in their correspondence, seem to fix this relation upon the Duke of Queensberry. Selwyn's interest was that of a man who, though without children, had a strong and unusual affection for the young. He looked forward to the pleasure her development and education would be to him, and to the solace of her companionship in old age. She enlisted his sympathy and devotion. From the first time he saw her he wished to adopt her, and until the end of his life she was first in his thought, and all his circle approved of his little friend. He soon made provision for her in his will, writing to Lord Carlisle July 26, 1774, that he must no longer delay in securing her future. In 1776 he placed her at school. After infinite trouble, Campden House was chosen, where every day he either saw her or received communications from the schoolmistress relative to her health, comfort, and happiness. Mrs. Terry presents her compliments to Mr. Selwyn. Has the pleasure to assure him that dear Mademoiselle Fagniani is as well today as her good friend could possibly wish her to be. She is this minute engaged in a party at High Romps. Mrs. Terry presents her best compliments to Mr. Selwyn, is very sorry to find that he is so uneasy. The dear child's spirits are not depressed. She is very lively, ate a good dinner, and behaves just like other children. She hopes Mr. Selwyn will make no scruple of coming tomorrow morning, or staying his hour, or more if he likes it. She will then talk to him about the head, but in the meantime begs he will not suppose that the dear child suffers by his absence, or that anything is neglected, for if Mrs. Terry thought Mr. Selwyn could suppose such a thing, she would wish to resign the charge. She begs he will come tomorrow. Mia was a disturbing element, if also a satisfaction, in Selwyn's life, for at all times overhanging present pleasure in her company was the dread of losing her. In August of 1776 the Marchesa Fagniani and her husband came to England. Selwyn had a fairly satisfactory interview, in which it was settled that the child should not leave him for a year. Before the time had expired he was exhausting every means to procure a longer delay. He even applied to the Austrian ambassador that the governor of Milan should use his influence with the family. But her return was insisted upon, and in August of 1777 Mia left England to join her parents in Paris. The most careful and elaborate arrangements were made by Selwyn for her safety and comfort while traveling, and a list of the houses where stops were to be made given to faithful attendants. He dreaded, however, the pain of parting with the child, and when the day of her departure arrived he absented himself to avoid the farewell, and his spirits and health suffered from her loss. 2 months later Carlyle writes, I never thought your attachment extraordinary. I might, for your sake, have wished it less in the degree, but what I did think extraordinary was that you would never permit what was most likely to happen ever to make its appearance in your perspective. March speaks with great tenderness and real compassion for your sufferings. Have you been at Lady Holland's? Are you in my house? Do not stay too long at Frognal. Change the scene, it will do you good. Gratify every caprice of that sort, and write to me everything that comes into your head. You cannot unload your heart to any one who will receive its weight more cheerfully than I shall do. But next year we hear of Selwyn at Milan negotiating with Mia's relatives for her return. His proposals to make settlements on her met with alternate rebuffs and promises that kept him in a state of intermingled fear and hope. He was finally put off with the understanding that she should return to him in the spring, and in October he turned homeward. In the spring it was arranged that the Marchesa Fagniani should bring Mia to Paris to be left a few weeks in a convent before Selwyn should claim her. The meeting did not take place without a last trial of patience for him. He arrived in Paris in April, expecting to find the little traveler, but he was informed that the departure from Milan had been delayed for a few days. This was followed by the news of a change of plans, and that Selwyn must go to Lyons to meet the child, who would be conducted there by her mother, a meeting Selwyn had wished to avert. Eventually, early in May, we read the congratulations of his friends on the restoration of what had become dearest to him in the world. During the month Selwyn spent in Paris, however, waiting for Mie, who was passing the specified time in the convent, fresh difficulties were raised, and he began to doubt if he should ever bring the little girl to England. His health was seriously affected by the strain, and his friends begged him to give up a pursuit which was injuring it and taking him from them. But Mie was at last received from the convent under a vague condition that at some future time she should return to it, a half-promise which either side expected would be fulfilled. The Rev. Dr. Warner gives us a slight description of Mie. A year had passed, she is 9 years old, he is writing to Selwyn. That freshness of complexion I should have great pleasure in beholding. It must add to her charms, and cannot diminish the character, sense, and shrewdness which distinguish her physiognomy, and which she possesses in a great degree, with a happy engrafting of a high-bred foreign air upon an English stock. But how very pleasant to me was your honest and naive confession of the joy your heart felt at hearing her admired. It is, indeed, most extraordinary that a certain person who has great taste, would he had as much nature, should not see her with very different eyes from what he does. I can never forget that naive expression of Madame de Sévigné, je sais comment von fait de ne pas aimer sa fille? The Duke of Queensberry. But Selwyn was never quite free from the fear that she should be taken from him. In January 1781, he writes to Lord Carlisle. From Milan things are well, at least, no menaces from thence of any sort, and I am assured by one who is the most intimate friend of the Emperor's minister there, that he was much more likely to approve than to disapprove of Mie's being with me, knowing as he does the turn and character of the mother. The relationship from this time was more settled, and as Mie grew into womanhood she became to Selwyn a delightful and affectionate companion. Selwyn was a universal friend. He was equally at home with politicians, dilettanti, and children. He was a man of such consistent good nature, so unaffectedly kind-hearted, that every one, statesman, gambler, or schoolboy, liked to be in his company. Yet among Selwyn's many friends and acquaintances 2 groups are remarkable. The first was formed of men of his own age. Walpole, Edgecombe, Gilly Williams, and Lord March comprise what may be called the Strawberry Hill group. It was at Walpole's famous villa that they liked best to meet, and it is by Reynolds that Walpole's out-of-town party has been handed down to us. They were an odd coterie, cultivated, artificial, gossiping. None of them ever married. To do so seemed to have been unfashionable, if not unpopular, and when we see the results of many marriages among their friends, they were best, perhaps, as bachelors. They considered themselves free to act as they pleased, and this freedom became notorious by the lifelong dissipation of March, and by the free living of Edgecombe, who died at 45 after a life misspent at the gaming table. That he possessed a bright mind and ingenious wit is proved by his verses and by the estimate of his friends. The amusing coat of arms which the Friends designed for White's Club was painted by him, while he was one of the first to recognize the genius of Reynolds. The group of Selwyn, Edgecombe, and Williams which was painted for Horace Walpole in 1781, and subsequently became the property of the late Lord Taunton, now belongs to his daughter, the Hon. Mrs. Edward Stanley, and is at Quantock Lodge, Bridgewater. It is a charming and interesting picture. A replica by Sir J. Reynolds, the property of Lord Cadogan, is at Chelsea House. The other group was of a younger generation, more brilliant and more modern. They might not inappropriately be called the Fox group, since his personality was so conspicuous among them. They talked politics and gambled at Brooks's, they appreciated each other's brightness, and lost their money with the indifference of true friends. There was the gallant and charming soldier Fitzpatrick, the schoolfellow and friend of Fox, the sagacious and versatile but place-seeking Storer. Hare, who, less well-born, had risen by his wit and talents to a place among the cleverest men of the time. The Hare with many friends, as he was called by the Duchess of Gordon. Frederick, Earl of Carlisle, and Crawford, the Petit Crawford, of Madame du Defa, and chief of all was Charles Fox, who to Selwyn was incomprehensible. Selwyn had been his father's friend, and had known him from childhood. He loved him and liked his companionship, yet his unrestrained folly at the gambling table and on the racecourse, his loose ideas on money matters, and his political opinions, at times annoyed, irritated, and puzzled him almost beyond endurance. With the older and the younger group Selwyn was on the same terms of intimate friendship, now pleasing by his wit, and now helping by his kindness and common sense. Castle Howard was the place, outside London, which most attracted him. It is even today a long way from the metropolis, and one feels something like surprise that such a lover of the town as Selwyn could, even to the end of his life, undertake the tiresome journey to Yorkshire. But in the stately galleries of Vanbragh's design he renewed his associations with France. There he was not bored by country society. In the home circle he had all the company he needed. He could look out over the rolling uplands and see the distant wolds, contented to observe and enjoy them from afar amidst the books and pictures which his host had collected. If he wanted exercise, the spacious gardens were at hand, and the artificial adornment of temples and statuary pleased a taste highly cultivated after the fashion of the times. In a drawing-room Selwyn was as welcome as in a club, and he could only be said to be out of place in his own country house, more especially at the time of an election for Gloucester. The modern love of landscape, of country life as an aesthetic pleasure, was unknown to him. Civilization, refinement, seemed to him to be confined to London and Paris, to Bath or Tunbridge Wells. Now estio per part ire, and I ought in point of discretion to set out tomorrow, but I dare say 'twill be Friday evening before I'll have the courage to throw myself off the cart. But then go I must, for on Monday our assizes begin, and how long I shall stay the Lord knows, but I hope in God not more than 10 days at farthest, for I find my aversion to that part of the world greater and more insufferable every day of my life, and indeed have no wish to be absent from home but to go to Castle Howard, which I hope that I shall not delay many days after my return from Gloucestershire. August, 1774. A week later he had arrived at his home. The weather is very fine, and Matson in as great beauty as a place can be in, but the beauties of it make very little impression upon me. In short, there is nothing in the eccentric situation in which I am now that can afford me the least pleasure, and everything I love to see in the world is at a distance from me. August 9, 1774. Today such a man as Selwyn would have had a choice collection of watercolors. He would be ashamed if he could not appreciate the tone and tenderness of an English landscape. But though a friend of Reynolds and of Romney, though he commissioned and appreciated Gainsborough, and valued the masterpieces of the past, in a word, was essentially a man of culture, yet this phase of modern refinement was utterly unknown to him. As a politician Selwyn, as has already been said, was a sinecurist. He never took a political interest in affairs of state, and he looked at events which have become historical from an unpolitical point of view. But though he writes of parliamentary incidents as a spectator, there is always in his letters a personal characterization which gives them vividness and life. For his long parliamentary career brought Selwyn continually into contact with many varied personalities of several political generations. When he entered the House of Commons, Henry Pelham was Prime Minister, and the elder Pitt had not yet formed that coalition with the Duke of Newcastle which enabled him to command a majority in the House of Commons and to be the greatest war minister of the century. When Selwyn died, still a member of Parliament, the younger Pitt was Prime Minister, and the French Revolution had upset that old regime which Selwyn had known so well. In his time Pelham, Newcastle, Bute, Grenville, Chatham, Grafton, North, Rockingham, Shelburne, and Portland were successively heads of administrations. Of some of these, and of many who served under them, Selwyn was a friend. Of the political and personal life of every one of them he had been an interested spectator. There was no man of the age who had a longer period of parliamentary observation and of personal association with the leading politicians of the time. But this intimacy with political personages never impressed him with the importance of political office. "You will not believe it, perhaps," he once wrote to Lady Carlisle when he had been asked to meet Pitt at dinner, "but a minister of any description, though served up in his great shell of power, and all his green fat about him, is to me a dish by no means relishing, and I never knew but one in my life I could pass an hour with pleasantly, which was Lord Holland." Cabinet ministers of the 18th century belonged to a single section of society, which included every one of note and every one in it knew their faults and their failings. They were not afraid of offending constituents, or of being lectured in leading articles. Thus their littleness, rather than their greatness, was apt to impress a daily observer like Selwyn, and to give to his remarks an aspect of depreciation and of pessimism. That Selwyn was a gossip, no one knew better than himself, and he has incurred the censure of Sir George Trevelyan for repeating tittle-tattle, as he calls it, about Fox and his gambling. But posterity desires to see the real Fox, not an ideal statesman, to see a man as he lived, not only a political figure. Looking back for more than a century, we may very well appreciate to the full Fox's great qualities and yet be aware of his weaknesses and his vices, in which he showed the strength of a passionate and virile character in contact with certain characteristics of the society of the age. Instead, therefore, of blaming Selwyn for repeating to correspondence the minor incidents of the time, we ought to be thankful to him for enabling us to picture so many of the leading personages of that day as they were. If we look to a period before or after that of Selwyn, we see an immortal gossip in Pepys, and in Greville another who will be read after the works of eminent historians have been put on upper shelves as out of date. The detailing of the minor facts of life without malice and with absolute truth enables posterity to form a sound judgment on a past age. Among the amusements of the society in which Selwyn delighted was one which now seems both morbid and cruel, that of attending the execution of those condemned to capital punishment. Even to his friends and immediate successors, no less than to those who have written of him, the fact that a man so full of kindness, who took pleasure in the innocent companionship of children, could with positive eagerness witness the hanging of a thief at Tyburn, has been a cause of surprise. When one is conversant with the history of the time, the astonishment is ridiculous. The sight of a man on the gallows no more disturbed the serenity of the most good-natured of men at the end of the 18th century than do the dying flutters of a partridge the susceptibilities of the most cultured of modern sportsmen. Selwyn was ever trying to get as much amusement out of life as possible, and he would have been acting contrary to all the ideas of the fashionable society of his age if he had sat at home when a criminal was to die. It was said of Boswell, just as it was of Selwyn, that he was passionately fond of attending executions. We need not therefore be surprised that Selwyn did as others of his time. Gilly Williams was a kind and good-natured man, yet we find him writing to Selwyn, "Harrington's porter was condemned yesterday. Cadogan and I have already bespoken places at the braziers, and I hope Parson Digby will come time enough to be of the party. I presume we shall have your honour's company, if your stomach is not too squeamish for a single serving." Another friend, Henry St. John, begins a letter to Selwyn by telling how he and his brother went to see an execution. "We had a full view of Mr. Waistcott as he went to the gallows with a white cockade in his hat." Not to be wanting in the ordinary courtesies of the time, Selwyn's correspondent presently remarks, as one nowadays would do of a day's grouse shooting, "I hope you have had good sport at the Place de Grève, to make up for losing the sight of so notorious a villain as Lady Harrington's porter. Mais licences laissez discours triste, and let us talk of the living and lively world." Selwyn made his world brighter by his wit and pleasantries, and the sight of an execution did not depress his spirits. "With his strange and dismal turn," wrote Walpole, "he has infinite fun and humour in him." And the author of a social satire blunted his thrusts at Selwyn by a long explanatory note which concludes with the remark that "George is a humane man." Letters, Volume 2. 315. The Diaboliad. Page 18. See Chapter 3. It was Selwyn's fate, and in every generation we find someone of whom the same may be said, to have his characteristics or foibles exaggerated. It occurred to him in regard to witticisms and the sight of executions. He did not complain of this, for he knew it would be useless, but he disliked to be regarded as an habitual jester or as possessing an unnatural taste for horrors. George, as soon as the king had spoken to him, withdrew and went away. The king then knighted the ambitious squire. The king afterwards expressed his astonishment to the group in waiting that Mr. Selwyn should not stay to see the ceremony, Observing that it looked so like an execution that he took it for granted Mr. Selwyn would have stayed to see it. George heard of the joke, but did not like it. He is, on that subject, still very sore. Journals and Correspondence of Lord Auckland, Volume 2, page 210. But another and more widespread habit is often referred to in his letters. The gambling which Selwyn disapproved, but indulged in for years, is constantly alluded to in his correspondence. The hold which this vice had upon nearly every one who regarded himself as belonging to the best society of London has never been more clearly and vividly depicted than in Selwyn's letters. It was the protest, always varying, always taking new forms, but always present, against the monotony of life. Fortunes were nightly lost at Brooks's and White's, and substantial sums were gambled away by ladies of position and of fashion in the most exclusive drawing-rooms in order to kill time. Selwyn himself was a sagacious and careful man, but he was nevertheless a moderate gambler. He always perceived the folly of it, and yet for a great many years he was constantly risking part of by no means a large fortune. The Green Table was the stock exchange and turf of the time. Men and women frequented the clubs and drawing-rooms where the excitement of gambling could be enjoyed as they now flocked to the racecourse or telegraphed to their brokers in Throgmorton Street. The nobleman now enjoys his pleasure side by side with the publican, and his example is followed by his servants on the course. Gambling in Selwyn's time was more select. A small society governed England and gambled in St. James's Street, while in more democratic days peers, members, and constituents pursued the same excitement together on the racecourse or in the city. Great as were the sums which were lost at commerce, hazard, or faro, they were less than the training stable, the betting ring, and the stock-jobber now consume, and the same influences which have destroyed the Whig oligarchy and the King's friends have changed and enlarged the manner and the habit of gambling in England. Of Selwyn the humorist it would be easy to collect pages of witticisms. Walpole's letters alone contain dozens of them, and there is not a memoir of the 18th century in which is not to be found one of George's jokes. Though often happy, as when seeing Mr. Ponsonby, the Speaker of the Irish Parliament, parting freely with banknotes at Newmarket, he remarked, "How easily the Speaker passes the money bills!" Or, as when Lord Foley crossed the Channel to avoid his creditors, he drily observed that it was a Passover not much relished by the Jews. Yet their repetition now is tiresome. Manner and appearance assisted his wit, an impassive countenance hid his humor so that his sallies surprised by their unexpectedness. He knew how to appropriate opportunity, and saw the humor of a situation. A reputation for wit is thus gained not only by what is said, but by the mere indication of the ridiculous. This it is impossible to reproduce, and the celebrity of Selwyn as a wit must be allowed to rest on the opinion of his contemporaries. Je suis bien éloigné, wrote Madame du Defa in 1767, who, of those who knew him, has left us the most finished portrait. De quorum, Selwyn stupide, mais ils souvent dans les espaces imaginaires. Rien ni le frappe ni le revendique le ridicule, mais il attrape en volant. Il a de la grâce et de la finesse dans si tu il dit mais il ne sait pas causer de suite. Il est distrait, indifferent. Il est ennuyé souvent sans en trace bonne recette tu il a contre l'ennui. C'est de s'endormir quand il veut. C'est un talent que j'ai lui envie bien. Si j'ai l'avise, j'ai en ferais grand usage. Il est malin sans être méchant. Il est officieux poli, or son milord March, Illinois en reine, en any saurait former aucune liaison avec lui, mais en est bien aise de l'encontrer, d'être avec lui dans la même chambre, quoique en est reine à lui dire. Asterisk. Asterisk. Correspondence complete de Madame du Defa. Volume 1, page 87. There is a popular idea that in the 18th century England and France were essentially hostile nations, immemorial enemies, yet at no time had there been more sympathy between two sections of society than there existed between the governing and fashionable men and women of Paris and London. In literature, art, and dress they held the same opinions. Englishmen braved the Channel and underwent the fatigue and trouble of the two land journeys with cheerfulness in order to enjoy the society of St. Germain. They were received not as strange travelers, but as valued friends. Of this Francophile feeling of the 18th century, Selwyn was the most remarkable example. He was as much at home in the salon of Madame du Deffat, or at one of President Henault's famous little dinners, as in the drawing-room of Holland House or the card-room at Brooks's. He introduced Walpole and Crawford to French society, adding to the social and literary connection between Paris and London during a time when political ties were broken. He was a favorite, too, with the French Queen. Under date of February 10, 1764, the Earl of March writes to him from Fontainebleau. The Queen asked Madame de Mirepoix, "Est-il en n'avait pas beaucoup entendu me dire de Monsieur Selwyn et.l.? Elle a répondu, oui beaucoup, madame. Je ne suis bien aise, dit la reine." Maria Leskedinsky, daughter of Stanislaus, King of Poland, and Queen of Louis XV. The correspondence of Madame du Deffat contains frequent allusions to the intimacy between the first English and French society of the period. David Hume, Lord Ossory, Lady Hervey, Lord March, the Duke of York, and other well-known English names, are mingled with Rousseau, Voltaire, d'Alembert, and the Duc and Duchesse de Choiseul. This oddly assorted company moves in the world of M. de Maurepas and of the Duc d'Aiguillon, and is seen in the charming salons of Madame Geoffrin and Madame d'Épinay. The beauty of Lady Pembroke is commented on, the charm of Lady Sarah Bunbury analyzed, Lady Grenville eulogized. Edward, Duke of York, 1739–1767, brother of George III, visited Paris the summer of 1767, on his way to Italy, where he died September 17. There is an irresistible fascination in the study of the men and women of the 18th century of France and England. Their manners and customs, have disappeared forever. But Gainsborough's gracious women, Sir Joshua Reynolds's charming types, and Romney's sensitive heads, have in England immortalized the reign of beauty of this period. In France the elegance and grace of the time are shown in the canvases of Groys, Van Loo, and Fragonard, in the cupids and doves and garlands which adorn the interiors of Madame de Pompadour. It was a time of great intellectual development and progress in both countries. It was the epoch of the salons, of the philosophers and encyclopedists, of a brilliant society whose decadence was hidden in a garb of seductive gaiety, its egotism and materialism in a magnificent appareling of wit and learning. Literary standing in France at once gave the entree to society of the highest rank and to circles the most exclusive. David Hume, whose reputation as philosopher and historian had been already established there, was received with enthusiasm when he accompanied Lord Hertford to Paris as Secretary of Embassy, though his manner, dress, and speech were awkward and uncouth, but his good-humored simplicity was accepted and appreciated, as was his learning. He had begun in England a correspondence with the Comtesse de Boufflers. He was made welcome too in the salons of Madame Geoffrin and of Mile de Lespinasse, and he soon became intimate with d'Alembert and Turgot. His reception was no less cordial at court, where the children of the Dauphin met him, prepared with polite little speeches about his works. He had such admiration for Rousseau that he brought him to England, assisting him there in spite of Horace Walpole's ill-natured jest on the flight of the susceptible French philosopher. During Burke's visit to Paris in 1773 he was often present at Madame du Deffat's supper parties, who said that although he spoke French with difficulty he was most agreeable. Here and at other salons he met the encyclopedists and obtained the insight into French morals and philosophy which, in his case, strengthened conservative principles. When Clarissa Harlowe appeared in Paris, the book created a sensation and was more talked of there than in England. Diderot compared Richardson, as the father of the English novel, to Homer, father of epic poetry. In England men of letters were far less recognized in society. Walpole remarked, "You know, in England we read their works, but seldom or never take notice of authors. We think them sufficiently paid if their books sell, and of course leave them in their colleges and obscurity, by which means we are not troubled with their vanity and impatience." But Walpole overdrew the picture, for though literature did not hold the place in London that it did in Paris, yet wit was never more appreciated, and learning added to the equipment of the first of the fine gentlemen of the time. Of this unique state of society and of international friendliness Selwyn and his friends were the products. We cannot too clearly realize them as types which can never recur. The secret of Selwyn's charm lies in the contrasts of his character. His versatility and cosmopolitan sympathies attract us now as they attracted in his lifetime men very different in habits, pursuits, and mind. The first Lord Holland, Horace Walpole, the Duke of Queensberry, each a type of the society of the 18th century, the unscrupulous politician, the cultivated amateur and man of letters, the sportsman with half the opera dancers in London in his pay, of all he was the closest friend. The most intimate of them, the Duke of Queensberry, led an extravagant and a dissipated life, in contrast with which Selwyn's was homely and simple. He could leave the gambling table of the club to play with Mia Mia or a schoolboy from Eton, while his friends were crippled by dice and cards and became seekers after political places by which they might live. He was prudent in his play, and neither ruined himself nor others. He had a self-control and a sound sense, which were not common in his generation. We see them in the tranquil, contemplative eyes of Reynolds's portraits, ready in a moment to gleam with humor. By reason of his unfailing good nature, he was always at the service of a friend. Himself without ambition, he watched men, not possessed of his tact and ability, rise to positions which he had never the least desire to fill. In an age of great political bitterness and the strongest personal antagonism, he continued the tranquil tenor of his way, amused and amusing, hardly ever put out except by the illness or the misfortune of a friend. George Selwyn died this day se'night, wrote his friend Storer to Lord Auckland. A more good-natured man or a more pleasant one never, I believe, existed. The loss is not only a private one to his friends, but really a public one to society in general. Gaiety of temperament and sound sense, a quick wit and a kind heart, sincerity and love of society, culture without pedantry, a capacity to enjoy the world in each stage of life, these are seldom found united in one individual as they were in George Selwyn, and he is thus for us perhaps the pleasantest personality of English society in the 18th century. Journal and Correspondence of Lord Auckland, Volume 2, page 383. Chapter 2. 1767 to 1769. The correspondence commences. Frederick, 5th Earl of Carlisle, Lady Sarah Bunbury, the Duke of Grafton, Carlisle, Charles Fox, and the Hollands abroad. Current events, card-playing, a dinner at Crawford's, Lady Bolingbroke, Almack's, the Duke of Bedford, Lord Clive, the Nabobs, Corporation of Oxford sell the representation of the borough, Madame du Defa, publication of Horace Walpole's Historic Doubts on Richard III, Newmarket, London Society, gambling at the clubs, a post promised to Selwyn, elections, a purchase of wine. Vauxhall. In the chapter which contains the earliest of Selwyn's letters to Frederick, Earl of Carlisle, something must be said of the correspondence itself. It was begun in 1767, and most of the letters which Selwyn wrote to Lord and Lady Carlisle from that date to his death have been preserved at Castle Howard. The collection is in many respects unique. It records a great number of facts, many no doubt small and in themselves unimportant, which, however, in the aggregate form a lifelike picture of English society in the 18th century. The letters are written in the bright and unaffected manner which Madame de Sévigné, whose style Selwyn so much admired, had introduced in France. Filled with human interest and easily expressed, they differ materially from Walpole's letters in that they are characterized by a greater simplicity and a less egotistical tone. They show a keener interest in his correspondent. There is in them a delightful frankness, an unconventional freshness. Walpole's correspondence, invaluable as it is, always bears traces of the preparation which we know that it received. But Selwyn, with a light touch, wrote the thoughts and impassions of the moment, never for effect. Walpole was often thinking of posterity, Selwyn always of his friends, who were numberless and who were in their time frequently his correspondents. How numerous Selwyn's letters must have been we know from the number to him which have been published, but with the exception of those which have fortunately been preserved at Castle Howard, his appear to have perished. Frederick, 5th Earl of Carlisle. 1748, born,